As in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church.
Yeah. So the text that I chose in this chapter, I've said this before. I originally did not want to write a Paul chapter because I was so irritated about how this conversation has become mired in simply debating what we believe about this text. And I'm like, there's no path forward in this. So I really didn't want to do it. My husband convinced me that I had to do it. And so I was like, okay, yeah,
And
it was.
to be clear, not because you have to submit to what your husband tells you to do in the book, but he's also theologically trained and was arguing.
Well, yeah. These are Roman words. These aren't Paul's words. And that's why they don't really fit in that passage. Everybody talks about how they're kind of jarring and, why do they fit there? But if Paul is saying, look, as he's talking about order and worship, and he's talking about, all sorts of, and he says, look, you say that women aren't supposed to do this, that they're supposed to ask their husbands at home. What?
It's shameful for a woman to speak in church. And then Paul's like, nah, all that's wrong. Beth Allison Barr is one person who promotes this view. So we're going to be looking at some of the stuff that she says, as well as some others. And let's look at hinge number 1 of this view. The first hinge is a secular quote. So this is the thing Beth Allison Barr promotes, and she's not alone in this. I just want you to be able to point you to, scholars, so you can see that these views are real. I'm not making them up. She says that the RSV represents this view in particular. And so let me put the RSV on your screen, and I'll read it the way that she has done so in her classes. She says that she'll actually read the RSV with certain inflections so that in classes, students will go, oh, and they'll understand the refutation view.
I was like, okay, I'm going to do Paul the way I teach Paul. These are my teaching examples that I use in my classroom.
So she'll start, I think probably would start at verse 34, my guess. The women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, even as the law says. If there's anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. What?
What?
Did the word of God originate with you? Or are you the only ones it has reached? You see how it sounds like a refutation now. Verse 36 sounds like it's saying like, what? Jeepers, how did you come to that conclusion? So that's how it's read. And she thinks the RSV actually, specifically this translation, supports this view. The first thing I want to point out in response to Beth Allison Barr, and in her case for this in her book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, which is a strongly egalitarian book, and it's very polemic as well. I've talked about it before, but and I don't say that in a good way, unfortunately. But the RSV, I don't think the RSV translators were trying to communicate what she's saying, because notice that they assign this section here, as in all the churches of the saints, the last part of verse 33, they assign it as the beginning of the sentence of verse 34. I don't think when they said what in verse 36, they meant it as a contradiction, because the quote starts with, as in all the churches of the saints, which is a statement that every church does this. The point here is just to say simply that it doesn't fit the idea that this is a quote of the Corinthians if it begins with a phrase, all the churches of the saints. Like, this is what's everywhere. And so, of course, it's going to be in the Corinthian church as well. This makes a lot out of the word what. Ultimately, the RSV just has the word what as an exclamation. It doesn't do all the labor, all the work that Beth Allison Barr wants it to do to show that it's a refutation. My point here is just to say, I don't think the RSV is actually supporting that view, not as far as I can tell. Most translations, by the way, would also agree with the RSV here. Most translations, I looked up a bunch of them, will assign this phrase, as in all the churches of the saints, to the following section, not the previous section. There's a little debate on that, which implies that this statement about women, this whole thing, this is something that's true across the churches in general. The second thing she'll do after explaining the thing and using the RSV is she'll use this secular quote that I alluded to a moment ago. And this secular quote is a quote from Livy.
Of course, in the aftermath, he's a couple of centuries after, 3 centuries after this, but nonetheless, Livy's recording it, And the words that he uses Cato saying is, what are these women doing running around in the streets? Why don't they ask their husbands privately at home? As soon as we allow women to influence us, they are going to rule us. I mean, I love the way that he ends this letter. And I was talking about it, and I just made an offhand comment to Charles Talbert. I said, every time I read that, it makes me think of Corinthians. And he just looked at me and he said, well, why do you think that is, Beth? And I just sat there and I was like, oh my gosh, is that a Corinthian quotation? And he was like, go back and read the text.
Yeah.
And ever since, it really blew my mind that day, because I went back and I read it and I was like, he is so right. That is what Paul is doing there. Or, it seems to me that's what these are Roman words. These aren't Paul's words.
Let me just put this on screen. And basically what she's going to be saying is, hey, here's a secular quote that looks a lot like the Corinthian quote. Therefore, it's an echo of the Corinthian quote is an echo of the secular quote. It's not from Paul. It's the Corinthians quoting this secular source, or this non-Christian source. I should really say non-Christian. At any rate, here is the quote. So this quote can be found in Beth Allison Barr's book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. But what she's quoting is Livy, this ancient source that the Corinthians, she's thinking, might be quoting. So here's how you can see there's a similarity that's going on there. I'm just going to quote the highlighted portion at the moment where he says, could you not have asked your own husbands the same thing at home? This is so similar to the phrase we have in 1 Corinthians, which says, and I'll put that back on your screen here, right? So you can remind yourself of it. If there's anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home. So we've got an interesting connection. And she says, hey, this is an echo. Let me share with you what Beth Allison Barr says about this. It isn't word for word, but it is close, a definite echo of Livy. In other words, Paul's words are drawing from his Roman context. This is part of her case that, hey, it wasn't Paul. This isn't Paul's idea. This is Paul responding to an idea that's present in the culture, right? So it's a reference to a quote, an idea that's not from Paul. So you get the point. She uses a similarity to say that the passage represents extra biblical ideas that the Corinthians have, which Paul is refuting. It's not clear why she doesn't just conclude that Paul is the one quoting Livy. I don't see in her work where she mentions this. Maybe she did and I missed it. That's fair. It's possible. Why she doesn't just think, well, maybe Paul's quoting Livy. Maybe Paul actually agrees with Livy here. I'm not saying he does. I'm just saying we would want to at least eliminate that possibility if we're going to use the fact that this is similar to Livy to say that it was the Corinthians and Paul's refuting it. It just seems like there's a jump there that's not evidenced. I searched to confirm, though, how parallel this quote is. Is it really an echo? Is 1 Corinthians 14 really echoing Livy? And I think it's not. So let me walk you through the reasons why I think we should set aside this argument, and I hope you'll consider it. The translation I'll be using of Livy comes from Evan T. Sage. He's a PhD professor of Latin, head of the Department of Classics in the University of Pittsburgh. And the quote that he has from Livy, let's look at it here. He actually reads it differently. He translates it, could you not have made the same requests, each of your own husbands at home? Now, that might seem like the same thing, but it's actually not. Questions are not requests. Although requests might come in the form of questions, it's a specific kind of thing. So in 1 Corinthians, we have women asking questions to learn things, because Paul says if they desire to learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home. In Livy, it's requests, as in they're asking for something to be done for them, something they want to have happen. It's not questions for educational purposes, it's requests. Isn't that interesting? Now, if you keep reading, I don't know what translation she's using. I'm not saying she's using a bad one or whatever, but let's follow this difference. Let's chase this down a little bit more. Now, if you keep reading the section of Livy and we expand a bit, we'll see it's not about asking questions to learn anything. The whole section supports the idea, and I'll put it all on your screen here, small font, but I'll read it to you, that what's really going on is these women are lobbying for political things, and it has nothing to do with learning or asking questions for informational purposes. So this is the longer quote from Livy in its context. And yet, not even at home, if modesty would keep matrons within the limits of their proper rights, did it become you to concern yourselves with the question of what laws should be adopted in this place or repealed. Our ancestors permitted no woman to conduct even personal business without a guardian to intervene in her behalf. This is Livy now, not Paul. They wished them to be under the control of fathers, brothers, husbands. We, heaven help us, allow them now even to interfere in public affairs. Yes, and here's what he's bothered by, and to visit the forum and our informal and formal sessions. What else are they doing now on the streets and in the corners and other corners except urging the bill of the tribunes and voting for the repeal of the laws? The thing that this quote in Livy that it's concerned with is women who are lobbying for political things in the government. So they're not asking questions to learn, which means that the connection, there's similar terminology being used, but the connection to 1 Corinthians, if they have any questions, if they want to learn anything, if they have any questions, let them ask their husbands at home. That's a completely different idea. The concept's different. What I'm suggesting is this does not seem like a definite echo. That was Beth Allison Barr's claim. It's a definite echo. That's her word for word statement there. It's about lobbying with requests, whereas 1 Corinthians 14 is concerned with some sort of questioning to learn things during church services. Again, I'll put that back on your screen just to make very clear. If there's anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home. We'll talk about how I would explain why, when, in what context this is considered a problem in a little bit. So, or in a long bit. We'll see how long this video is. So in Livy, they're not asking questions to learn. They're lobbying for their agenda, and he'd rather them ask their husbands, not so their husbands can teach them or inform them, but so that their husbands can go forward and be the ones doing the lobbying, right? Or just grant the request if it's like maybe they want something for themselves that he just says yes or no. That's what Livy's shooting for. Similar words, yes, but very different meanings. And if the concepts are different in the passages, then I don't think it's fair to call it an echo. Just similar words, husband and request or question, which are two different kinds of things. It just doesn't quite fit. So her case that this is an echo of Livy seems wrong. Also, even if it was an echo of Livy, why would that mean that Paul's not the one echoing Livy? Why would we assume it's the Corinthians echoing Livy? It doesn't make sense. It also seems to rob this passage of its prophetic context, the whole statements about prophecy and everything. So it's confusing, and I don't think it works.
Why do they fit there? But if Paul is saying, look, as he's talking about order and worship, and he's talking about, all sorts of, and he says, look, you say that women aren't supposed to do this, that they're supposed to ask their husbands at home. What?
She doesn't get into hermeneutics for the sake of understanding what Paul means. She delves as far as she needs to go in order to make the conclusions that she already brings to the text.